Welcome back, and we are continuing with two Q&A sessions with presenters. Again, the format is we kind of trying something. We're trying a synchronous format with recorded presentations and live Q&A sessions. And then our next session is Campus Climate for Undergraduate Student Success. And I would like to introduce Cassandra Alvarado, an Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education at UT Austin. And Cassandra, please, floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Igor. I'm Cassandra Alvarado. I'm a professor and associate dean at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm thrilled to chair this amazing session on campus climate and student success. This is a space near and dear to my heart, and I think that all of our presenters today did such a fabulous job in sharing on their videos some of the great work that's happening all across the consortium institutions. So we're really fortunate to have that today and to have a little discussion about some of what we've learned. So our format today is, in just a minute, I'm going to invite each team to introduce themselves and share about 2 minutes of a summary of their research. I know for all of us scholars, saying what we did in 2 minutes is a challenge, but I'm going to try and keep us on track. And then I'm going to pose a few questions to our group, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I will watch our chat and the hand raised function when we open it up to questions from the audience. So we were fortunate to have 6 amazing sessions. Only 5 of our presenters are able to be here today. So with regret, we won't hear directly from Christopher Escobar at UCLA, whose work you can still view on the YouTube channel. So to kick us off, I'd like to invite our team from the University of Minnesota to share with us what they learned in weaving CERU into institutional advancement of campus climate.
Hi folks, Bonnie, I'll let you, oh, sorry, go ahead. The other team?
Sorry, yeah, it's the other team, Krista. Our session is the next one. No worries.
Yeah, we need to be specific. So I'm going to take a moment to have my co-presenters introduce themselves, and then I'll summarize what we did. I'm Peter Radcliffe, the Director of Undergraduate Analytics at the University of Minnesota. Rajata.
Sorry, unmute. Virajita Singh. I serve as Associate Vice Provost in the Office for Equity and Diversity, and I'm a faculty in the College of Design, both at the University of Minnesota. Ron.
And I'm Ron Huesman. I'm Director of Institutional Research, Assessment, and Policy Analysis at the University of Minnesota.
So our session was weaving CERU into institutional advancement of campus climate. And diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is a top priority at our institution, as it is for most of our institutions. Multiple measures of diversity in the campus climate are woven through our system strategic plan and through the different levels and components of our internal organization. In this work, it's important to remember that identities are complex, multidimensional, and intersecting. We find that students with different combinations of identities may have very different experiences than their peers who share one of those multiple identities. CERU is critical for us, not just as a tool to measure the student experience, but as a source of information about these identities beyond what is recorded in our institutional data systems. Combining CERU with our institutional records can help us see how disparities propagate across the different stages of a student's experience. Looking across the consortium also helps us put our students' experience in context, seeing where we're an outlier and where we're similar to our peers. One example of these identities we can examine through CERU is sexual orientation, and we can see how students with differing sexual orientations experience our campus differently, and how intersections of sexual orientation and race ethnicity are associated with different experiences. This data is helping to inform our campus diversity and campus climate initiatives, and we've highlighted in particular our Multicultural Student Success Committee and our diversity data deep dives. These efforts help us to bring together faculty and staff from across the university to deepen their knowledge and to share insights. So thank you for having us, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Peter, and one of the University of Minnesota teams. We appreciate that. Let's move on to our colleagues from the University of California Office of the President for their session on diversity, campus climate, and student success at UC, 2 decades of change from 2000 to 2020.
Yes, thank you so much. So we have 4 presenters. First, I would like us to provide a brief introduction. Then I can talk about our results briefly.
Tongshan, we have troubles hearing you. Yeah, that would be better. Perfect.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great, thank you. Sorry about that. So we have 4 presenters in our team. So first, I would like us to have a brief introduction. Then I can talk about our summary. My name is Tongshan Tang. I'm a director for institutional research and academic planning at the UC Office of the President. Ola.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ola Popula. I'm the Director of Data Infrastructure, Reporting and Analytics for the University of California Office of the President.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yang Yang. I'm an IR analyst with UCOP Office of the President, Institutional Research. I work closely with Tongshan on surveys.
Courtney.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Sanders. I'm also an analyst in institutional research and academic planning at the Office of the President and work closely with Tongshan as well.
Thank you so much for your introduction. So as you all know, you see Office of the President and all UC campuses have been working very hard to increase diversity in terms of student body and also faculty and staff for and also work very hard to make changes and improve campus climate to provide better learning environment. So for our research of this presentation, we use a Silver Hurtado campus climate model to look at 3 things since 2000 in past 2 decades. The first one is about student diversity at UC. So mainly want to know how student diversity in terms of race, ethnicity have been changed over past 2 decades. Is there any gap in racial ethnic diversity? Then we look at psychological dimension of campus climate. So for this part, we mainly use UQ's data because the Center for Studies in Higher Education at UC Berkeley administered UQs in 2004, then in 2006 for all UC campuses. So we basically look at the change of students' feedback about campus climate from 2006 to 2020. Then we look at student success. So this is related to like student behavior in terms of the campus change, because the purpose we want to increase student diversity and improve campus climate is to make sure that students succeed. So we want to look at like how the change of diversity, improvement of campus climate actually is related to student success. So you have already probably watched the video, but the main findings are so in past 2 decades, you see undergraduate students diversity in terms of race, ethnicity has increased significantly. With more URM students, more first generation students, etc. However, the gap in racial ethnic diversity between California high school graduates and UC enrollment remain almost the same as over past 20 years. So there has not been significant change in the gap. The second finding is students' view on campus climate is slightly more positive now than 15 years ago, based on 2006 survey responses. But they feel students for their race, ethnicity are less respected on campus. And more students report a lower sense of belonging. So we also found that belonging is significantly related to student success in terms of persistence, four-year graduation rate, etc. So the last main point is freshman graduation rates have increased significantly since 2000. This is true for all subgroups, for all race, ethnic categories. But the belonging and respect of students' race and ethnicity, as I mentioned earlier, small students actually report a lower sense of belonging. This is statistically and positively correlated to the academic completion. So this is a kind of an area where we should make more efforts to help students, improve their sense of belonging. Hope this will help students complete their undergraduate education at UC. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tangshan. Let's move on to Beatrice Brando at UC Berkeley's presentation on resources and responsibilities, disparity in student experiences during COVID-19.
Hey, thank you all for having me. Our office did some research on students' experiences during COVID-19. So the UQs, which uses SERU as its core, but has some additional items, was launched right as COVID started picking up a lot in the country and everything started going remote. So we very quickly added in some items about COVID-19, and the data from that has been really helpful, both on our campuses and I think across the UC system as we have navigated COVID-19. And in this particular presentation, I'm talking about kind of the limited access that certain students had to like learning resources and even basic needs, and the kind of additional family care responsibilities that kind of arose during this time. So just to kind of summarize the findings, we sort of found that a higher proportion of underrepresented minority students and Pell recipients, which we sort of used as a measure of low-income students, students being low-income students, that a higher proportion of these students were concerned about their learning resources, specifically having reliable access to the internet and having an appropriate study space, and also meeting their basic needs. And that also a higher proportion of these groups also reported having additional family care responsibilities. The other thing of note was that women were also more likely than men to have additional family care responsibilities, indicating some of these responsibilities were falling on traditional gender lines. So this is really important information, I think, to have as we, think about, supporting students during the COVID-19 pandemic, but even now as we're leaving the COVID-19 pandemic, that we need to be aware of the uneven challenges that students had during this time to avoid further deepening these inequalities that we saw and that were heightened during COVID-19.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's move on to Steve Brent at UC Riverside, sharing about raising graduation rates while maintaining equity at UC Riverside and the work that's happening there. Steve?
Thank you, Cassandra. So the presentation has to do with something that's special about our campus, which is it has historically exceeded the other UC campuses in terms of how welcoming students feel, how welcome students feel, and how much they feel like they are respected. And this is true of students in all of the major racial ethnic groups. And we've taken a lot of pride in that. We also have had near equity in our graduation rates. And by near equity, I mean within a percentage point or two in the 4 major racial ethnic groups. Our graduation rates, on the other hand, were pretty low relative to the other campuses. And we made a big push about 5 years ago to raise the graduation rates. So I would like to, and we were successful. Now they're about 10% higher than they previously had been at both the 4 and 6 year graduation rates. I'd like to share the screen. I think for this particular group, this one slide is important, and let me just share it with you. These are some of the things the campus does to try to make sure that it is a welcoming campus for all students. So there's, as you can see, there's regular engagement with parents groups, especially in underrepresented minority communities. We make regular trips to Los Angeles to talk to parents in the Black community. We put a huge emphasis on the cultural affinity groups and make sure that they have, they're well supported and well advertised, and they provide a kind of home for students who are first generation underrepresented students. We have a one-stop shop for student services. They go to one place in one building to take care of everything from advising to financial aid questions. And that reduces the kind of the bureaucratic jumble. We have a large number of programs in science and engineering to foster the success of underrepresented students. This is where our students tend to stumble. Those who are going in to STEM fields tend to have a more difficult time. And so we have put a lot of support into early research experiences beginning in the summer before freshman year. New staff and faculty are taken on bus rides in the impoverished neighborhoods where many of our students come from. We have a majority minority campus. I think the white population is about 15%. Many of our students come from low-income families, and so we take the new faculty and staff to some of these neighborhoods so they can get a sense of where our students are coming from. And then finally, the campus leadership is highly devoted to diversity and social mobility in their messaging. This is something that is a constant. And I think the campus reputation is built on itself as well. It's known as a place that values diversity, where students from all groups do graduate at equal numbers. And I think that kind of reputation does build on itself. Now, if there are questions about what we did to raise graduation rates while maintaining equity in our across racial ethnic groups, I'll be happy to take them later. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots to share there. And last but not least, Andy Zanner at Purdue sharing some understating campus climate data from across CERU data elements. Andy.
Thanks, Cassandra. Yes, I compared 2018 data from the AAU campuses. So if anything I say doesn't sound right for California, I'm not asserting that it is. I was only looking at those non-California campuses. When we talk about majority and minority one thing that's important to remember is that on probably all of our campuses, 80 or 90% of our students are non-majority in one category or other. Whether it's race or some other category, a great majority of the students identify with one of the non-majority categories in one or more of those areas. The CIRU does a great job of giving us different ways to look at campus climate issues, and that's very useful. It also makes it possible for anyone who wants to tell a story to find something that helps, that supports their conclusion. And because it's hard to say whether this way of presenting it or that way of presenting it is the more meaningful one, it's possible to get many different stories from it. What I did was look at those, the combination of all the campuses AAU campuses, who did the CIRU in 2018. And when you ask the general cardinal question, for instance, my race is respected on this campus, you get a very favorable response. If you say my gender is respected, my disability status, etc., in every case, you get a very strong favorable response, and that's something that administrators want to tell. When you slice it by the majority and the non-majority group, then these very great gaps emerge. This is not surprising to anyone. Tongshan described that in his presentations. The thing that I found is that among the campuses that I was looking at, there's a linear correlation between the percentage of majority students, that is to say, the percentage of white students on the campus, and the percentage of favorable comments to my race is respected on this campus. There shouldn't be a linear correlation between the percentage, because that's suggesting that the percentage of white students is about the only thing that's mattering, about the only thing that's shaping these outcomes. And that should not be the case. So I was quite shocked by that. The majority group, whether it's men, white, non-disability, cisgender, is predominant in every campus and in the campuses overall, in all of these measures. So I found that a shocking surprise, not that it was that way, but that it was such a strong linear correlation across all the multiple campuses.
Thanks, Andy. And I'd like to kind of play off that statement that you made about it is likely that the majority of students on our campuses are non-majority in at least one category of identity, and sort of turn that back into a question for our panelists. Is this something that you see having a significant impact on campus climate? And sort of the follow-up to that is, and so what are we doing about it? I'll turn it over to our panelists. Who'd like to start?
I'll briefly address it while others formulate their thoughts. We have good programs to try to bridge the gap and to try to help minority students and students of different cultures to incorporate and to feel at home. They're all on too small of a scale to show up as an impact in the CIRU. The CIRU is the one source that administrators have of the overall campus sentiment. And I don't know if others have the same experience, but for me, many times the director of a cultural center will say, no, that can't be right. I know my students. I know the students who come into my center, and your data don't describe their feelings. And it's true. The ones who choose to come in and get engaged in the cultural center have a home, have a center, have a feeling that they do belong here. All the ones that haven't made it into the cultural center and haven't connected with that or any other hub are the ones that the CIRU is measuring and reporting. So when you get, as on my campus in 2020, less than 20% of Black students feeling that they're respected on our campus. That is the general sentiment of students. So to get back to Cassandra's question, what they're doing is attempting very personal programs that work well, but on too small of a scale to affect the whole climate.
Steve, it looks like you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think our campuses, at least in California, have been primarily concerned with the assimilation and the sense of climate among racial ethnic minorities and socioeconomic strata, and to a lesser degree now, though not in the past, gender and sexual orientation. So undoubtedly what you say is true, that everybody is a minority, but it's in some way, what the institutions tend to focus on are their sense of the groups that have had the most difficulty in higher education having a kind of equal treatment. And so that's why we see this institutional focus. And I think it's appropriate, but it does flare up once in a while with other groups. So we occasionally will have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will flare up on our campuses, and those groups are not really, we don't focus on them as much as other groups, but there are flare-ups. And now I would say campus climate this year has been strained, partly because of the pandemic, but the form it takes is political, and it's mostly faculty and graduate students. So the people who are more traditional in terms of their academic values versus the people who want more thorough transformations of our institutions to combat what they perceive as racism on campus. Those have been major conflicts now, and we may need to turn our attention to some degree in the future to the political climate if it persists beyond the pandemic year.
Hi, Cassandra. I have a couple of thoughts. One of them is the synonymous use of the concept of equality and equity. They don't mean the same thing. That's one thing. The other thought that comes to my mind is when we're talking about, for example, African-American students, because I can probably identify with that a lot more than anything else. We're talking about sense of belonging and feeling respected. Could it possibly be, and I don't have all the answers, but could it be that we're looking at this in too simplistic of a way, whereby we say if we have programs and we have cultural centers that people can walk into, that solves the problem. But does it solve the problem? Could it be that representation is an issue, not just within the student body, but also within the faculty, saying that, do I feel a sense of belonging if every single member of faculty that I interact with, I can't find a single one that looks like me? As one of the students mentioned earlier about going to talk about mental health, and you go in there and every single person that you can talk to, nobody can identify with your experience. I always tell people that we might be in the same room, we might hear the same thing, but what you heard and what I heard might be completely different because my world is not the same as your world. So when we're talking about trying to create the sense of feeling respected as a minority, or having a minority student answer this UQ questions and saying, yes, I do feel respected. Yes, I do feel a sense of belonging. How do we accomplish that? Can we look at this in a more robust way, rather than just thinking that if I have a few programs here and there, which maybe I might measure how effective those programs are, and I may not bother to even measure the effectiveness of the programs because I think as long as I have them, then everything's okay. what can we do to actually find out how to solve these problems rather than using the same things that we've used historically over the years?
Sandra, if I might add to the points made, I agree with Ola and also the point Andy made. I think there are programs, but not all our students or majority of our minority students go to those programs. And this is, I'm speaking now of the University of Minnesota. I also think, and there are experts, I don't actively work with CERU other than use some of the data. There are experts who can speak to this in this audience, but what about intersectionality, right? I mean, because there are many students who relate to certain parts, certain aspects of their identity. I've actually been struggling with a little bit with Pacific Islander students who feel more connected to Indigenous students than they feel connected to, for example, the AAPI category, so that's one piece. The second is that the sense of belonging, as I've been doing institutional work, I'm becoming increasingly aware that the sense of belonging is actually in the programs and the units and the departments. And while we are looking at the data, of course, the data is parsed by departments and so on. I don't think there is a real deep understanding in the units and about the data, or maybe perhaps a working knowledge of the data and consistent commitment, I'll say, across the units to actually use that to change the outcomes year after year. And that, at least on our campus, feels like a big gap that still needs to be addressed.
I feel like one thing that all of our conversation, I think, hits on, which I think is so critical, is how important it is to look at the data, not just in aggregate, to like break it down into diverse groups and to think about because that's always the question, right? Like there are so many different ways that students can identify, and there's so many ways that those identities can intersect. So I think there's like a constant conversation we need to be having about like, how do we want to, like what kinds of data do we want to collect about students' identities and how those might show up and how those might intersect, so that we can do this constant work of seeing, is our university working for everyone? Because that's really what it breaks down to, I think, to some extent, when we see these gaps, is that like the university isn't working as well for some people. And like what, and then there's the question of like, how do we fix that, which is a huge, massive thing that requires a lot of thought. But I think like there's always a really important thing to start by asking like, who are the people at our university? Obviously a very challenging thing since you can identify and describe yourself so many different ways, but like, what are the ways that we can try to capture pieces of that? And then how do we use the information about like gaps or spaces or inequalities there to like then go out? And all of that's a big process, but I think like the very first step is by like, we're like acknowledging what we all have done here, which is that like, you can't just look at it in aggregate. That doesn't tell you the whole story.
I do think that that's something that all of our presentations today did a really fine job of highlighting, is the importance of looking and slicing the data a number of different ways to really try and understand and interrogate what's happening. My next question is to our panelists is one that came to me from a student who has been helping me on the University of Texas at Austin campus with studying and understanding this notion of campus climate. And I asked her, what do you think I mean when I say campus climate? And she was quick to respond. The questions about belonging and respect are easy. She knows what those mean. She knows what the feeling of belonging and respect means. But when I asked her to define campus climate, we had a long and sort of winding conversation about all of the different things that campus climate means. I think the question I'd like to pose back to our teams is the notion of a single campus climate as a singular one entity, something that we need to sort of push ourselves beyond to think about multiple campus climates or the campus climates from different lenses? And is campus climate even a word that we need to be thinking about and studying moving forward. So I'd like to challenge our panelists with that question.
I guess I'll start. I think that the questions that we have on the instrument are helpful because they give a sense of the overall feelings of, and we have enough people in different groups to drill down pretty deeply. I think they're meaningful, but of course, you're also right, and your student is right, that there may be a big climate. We talk all the time about climate change, and we know what that means. The Earth is getting hotter, or at least the atmosphere is getting hotter, and it's having consequences. But there's also microclimates, and we talk sometimes about microclimates. And it's no doubt on our campuses, there are microclimates in different departments. You see different departments have very, there's a lot of harmony. And in other departments, there's a lot of conflict and students don't feel as accepted. And so there's, and undoubtedly there's campus organizations where that would be true too. I think that, you know, it's possible to disaggregate as much as you want and to get into departments and get into campus organizations, but there ought to be, you know, I think it's more of an issue that if you identify particular department or particular organization that seems to be having problems, then yeah, there's a diagnostic and a prognostic and a treatment reason to do that. But otherwise, it could be a big expense of time and energy for little reward.
Kind of wondering too, coming off that, Steve, too, just in terms of institutions are like microcosms of their larger society. There's a reflection of forces outside of the institution that are influencing how students perceive, I think, climate. And I think our past president, you could see drops across groups on a lot of these right after that year happened. You know, how much influence do we have over what happens outside of our environments that we have some control over? I don't know. I don't have an answer for how to disentangle that, but I think it's part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think definitely campus climate includes a lot of different things. And probably more importantly, for different students or students with different backgrounds, I learned a lot from the discussion this morning. So students definitely had different perspectives based on their experience about campus climate. So the thorough instrument, UQ's instrument, includes some questions that could help us understand like macro definition of campus climate, but may not be enough to help us understand everything about the students' sense of belonging, students' perspectives about campus climate. And also it is probably important to know that for example, in past year, because students definitely, we also all had many challenges, and the students, thought about campus climate actually might be different because they definitely need more support from instructors, from administrators, as students said this morning, and but when we receive a lot more emails, then students may have different thoughts. Oh, emails are too long and the support may not be clear. So I think campus climate may change over years, over time. So we definitely need to think about in the future how we can define campus climate which could be different now than 15 years ago, but we still use some questions from 15 or 20 years ago. So we need to think about that.
Okay, I think what I'd like to do is pivot to some questions here from the audience. And I know that we've started some dialogue here in the chat. John started by sort of posing a question to understand more closely the UCOP presentation about the correlation between sense of belonging and grades and graduation rates. Perhaps we can get a little more clarity on that question. And that sort of begs some other questions. Are these changes, are these relationships linked to demographic differences between UC and other campuses and or tuition rates? So Tongshan and team, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I can provide some information, then other team members can add to that. Yes, and statistically, students' sense of belonging is correlated to their outcomes, like first-year persistence, four-year graduation. But the effect size is small. I think that this true in all institutions and also other research. But if I'm wrong, please correct me. So the influence is very small. But one thing is because we just look at like overall correlation for different groups and particularly on different campuses. So something could be different. That probably needs some kind of further analysis. So we can definitely look at that. But we know, there are a lot of factors that affect student progress, student completion, belonging, sense of belonging, campus climate, are just two among many of others. So we can definitely, we need to do a lot more work. I don't know if any other team members have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do agree, Tongshan, that it's not really simple, and sometimes we're always looking for simple answers to complex concepts, because you also have human behavior, which is quite individualistic, playing into each of these scenarios. And I particularly appreciate. I've always been concerned about the way the racial categories are grouped. In the sense that when you say underrepresented minorities, for example, African Americans, Hispanics, and American Indians are all in that bucket, but they're so different. And trying to find a solution to solve some of the issues that students that fall into that group, and coming up with one or two things might help one group, but not necessarily help the other. And also when you're saying, you have rules where you say, if you're Black and Hispanic, federal regulations, then that person is categorized as Hispanic. So some of those things are extremely complex. I have no solutions to any of them. I apologize, but I think more work, as Tongshan said, needs to be done in terms of beginning to understand these things at probably a much finer detail than we're used to today.
Agreed. Igor, I think you had a follow-up to this thread as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is helpful. I just wanted to maybe follow up a little bit to what Ola said, actually, and to add also one of the categories that's problematic to aggregate is international students, I think, because they are so different. And sometimes when we aggregating them into one category, this could mislead things. But I was thinking about this, small or even negative effect, and I was wondering, I was puzzled about the negative effect finding, and maybe Courtney or somebody else can comment on that in particular. But I was also wondering, have you looked at the effects for subgroups for this different student subpopulations? Maybe for them, there's much higher effect of campus climate. I think it's what basically Andy kind of outlines in his presentation, that if we consider this, for the whole campus, if you have a majority kind of a wide campus, then it's it's only for them. And I was wondering if you looked at the subgroups, if effects are larger, and can you comment on the negative effect? That's really intrigued me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that inverse relationship that we saw, because I think we were a bit puzzled by that as well. But like you mentioned, looking at some of the subgroups, that negative relationship didn't hold across all race ethnicity categories or across all campuses. So I think that's and we obviously couldn't fit that all into a short presentation. But I think that's something that we want to kind of delve further into, looking across different race ethnicity groups. And also delving further into those, because that was for the campus climate set of items. So also looking further at those specific items and looking at whether it's specific items that are causing that, that negative relationship versus the combination of all items together.
Yeah, another thing I want to add is because success, we just look at graduation. Success is a multifactorial thing. So graduation rate is just one among many other factors. So sense of belonging is central, maybe more correlated to other skills, like soft skills is central. But that is something we could explore more to better understand how that kind of thing affects students' success in college and success in the future job market. Because we have some data about post-baccalaureate employment, so we can definitely look at that.
Yeah, I agree. There are long-term effects as well that you can see in the data. If I may, can I ask another question? Okay, I have a question to Beatrice. Actually, I enjoyed the presentation, and it's a great and detailed analysis. I'm not sure if it was not a focus of your presentation, but I was wondering, like, what were the interventions at Berkeley campus that helped to address, the gaps that you found? Have you heard anything about that? Like, has anything been done?
I think some of the things that were done were to target those big concerns that students had. So for example, when a lot of students were starting to report that they were, at least a non-trivial number were reporting that they were concerned about having access to the internet, and through other things, we started hearing about students having concerns about their computers. Berkeley started a technology lending program where they would lend out laptops to students, and they would lend out Wi-Fi hotspots, so students would have access to the technology. I think another thing to keep in, this is another thing that was not necessarily a reaction, but was probably also helpful to students, is Berkeley still left some of their dorms open. So some students did remain on campus and lived on campus, even though they were taking their courses remotely. In terms of, I think it also just colored how people approached different things. I think advisors found it really helpful to know about students' experiences during COVID-19 so that they could have that context and that information in mind when they were approaching, talking to students. I know the Basic Needs Center did a huge effort to do outreach and develop a living document of resources for students. I think the financial aid office also did some repackaging based on what students reached out to them about. So I think the most concrete one was, I think, the STEP like laptop lending program, but there were so many, and I'm sure that there's a lot that I'm not even aware of. Just, I feel like you sometimes learn less about what's on the ground when you're in the data world.
Thank you.
I'm struck connecting some of the feedback we got from our students in the last session on the panel with some of our conversation and ideas about belonging and campus climate. And I'm struck by how much of students' reaction seems to be to very individual human one-to-one connections, a faculty member who asked how I was doing or let me flex on an assignment, or an office that said, here, let me take of your care of your specific technology need, or a center that says, we don't want you to have to run around to 10 places. We want you to come to one stop. And I'm wondering, as we look at all of these pieces, how much we need to think about our belonging as a very individual measure for each student. Steve, I imagine some of the work that y'all have done in sustaining equity while improving graduation rates can provide some insight at this.
Well, what I was thinking is that of the Purdue Gallup study from a few years ago, and Andy might know about this better than I do, but one of their findings was exactly what the students are saying, is that if there's one person on campus that they have a really strong personal relationship with, often that makes, and not just a fellow student, but somebody on staff or faculty, that often makes a huge difference in it and in how people think about their college experience. And so, how to have those, they used to talk about the 1,000 points of light. This is from way back, but how to have those on our campuses, might be a worthy thing for us to be thinking about. Making sure that every student has a strong connection with at least one or two staff or faculty, a personal connection. How to make that happen, I don't know, but it seems like they're giving us some strong clues that is important, and it's just it's very much along the lines of the Gallup-Purdue study.
If I might add to that, I think that's a great point, Stephen. Perhaps this is where that linkage between the data we're seeing and hearing the stories of the students, and then bringing it home in our units, department, individual faculty, that there needs to be some sort of adopt a student kind of, strategy where you're actually committing as a college or a unit that wants to improve its climate, has a team of people who are actually committed in some intangible ways to doing that, rather than sort of, it will happen if it happens, And again, it's not probably something that people who are present today can do it alone, but it requires organizing on our campuses.
Andy.
Okay, thanks. It would help us if we understood, when we say campus climate, exactly where the locus or the loci of affinity is. Do students really have a relationship with the university, or do they have a relationship with a club or a church or a job or a residence hall or a lab or a study abroad trip? I'm quite surprised at our campus at the number of people who say, my greatest, most significant, I think is the word, my most significant learning experience throughout all my years at this campus was the orientation program. Even seniors are saying the best thing about my time at Purdue was the 3-day orientation program the summer we started. And isn't that pathetic? Isn't that wrong? That the training at the beginning was better than anything that followed, So to refocus, and I'm agreeing, we need to understand whether students have a relationship with the whole campus, or if having that intimate feeling of home and being understood and belonging can be as small as, you know, a study group even. And the students who don't find that anywhere are the students that are very disaffected. I've gone through the comments that the students said, and it's entirely confirmation bias, where I look, you know, and I find a student who is deeply involved in a club, and oh yeah, that proves my theory. But I suspect, and this is just a speculation, white students can have a relationship, white cisgender male Indiana resident engineering students on my campus can have a relationship with the whole campus, but the other groups, when they say I feel that I belong, they mean I belong in this group. And it's the ones who don't find a place to belong in any of those areas that really are unhappy on the campus.
I think we have time for about one more question from our amazing panelists. Let me check our chat, but if anyone would like to unmute and just ask the question, please go ahead.
I picked up on something that Andy just said now that maybe might require a little bit of clarification for me, in the sense that a white student might feel a sense of belonging with the entire campus, and a minority student might not. I wonder why that would be the case. There are many things that come to my mind as to why, but I would like to ask you if you have any ideas as to why that would be the case.
Earlier, you yourself said that students sit down in a classroom and the instructor is rarely someone like them.
Mm-hmm.
They walk across the campus and everyone they can look at to their left or the right is not like them. On my campus, there's a tremendous disparity between the elite engineering program and the liberal arts program, who are literally criticized and put down by professors and the president of the university, that liberal arts is a lesser purpose of life. So we have this big disparity between our own colleges. And if everywhere they go, they're looking for affirmation and they find it in the Black Cultural Center, or they find it in a study abroad trip or somewhere, then that's enough to make them say, I belong on this campus because I've got my group. Whereas the white students, everywhere they look, they see other white students, other engineering students, other Indiana resident males. And so it's just much easier to plug in if you're in all those majority categories. That's my guess.
Yes, that sounds about right. Thank you.
So the comment you were making, though, about the kind of stereotypes that we sometimes have on the campus, like, made me think of something that I think is really powerful about survey data, which is that it can help in some ways sometimes to dismantle some of these like harmful narratives that sort of float around our universities about our students, or about like the assumptions that get made. And sometimes I wouldn't even say that they're prevalent, but sometimes you just need like a big enough minority to do damage. And I think it's really powerful when like our surveys allow us to kind of like, and like the way we analyze our surveys allow us to like kind of set the record straight and be like, yeah, that narrative that's been kind of floating around and maybe doing a bit of damage to some of our students, that's not right and you should stop.
Well, I think this has brought up some really amazing conversations and food for thought, I think, for all of us about how we think about campus climate, our culture and sense of belonging on campus, and how we use our data to uncover information that we don't know, or to challenge preconceived notions about our students and our campuses. I want to take a minute just to thank again all of our presenters for taking time to share their data with us, to pre-record their sessions, and then to participate in our dialogue today. I'm really grateful and so excited to see how all of the CERU and UQ's data are being used on our campuses. So thanks again to all of our panelists.